Hello and welcome to the eTech podcast with me, your host, Ryan Morn. I have been involved in the development of electrified vehicles and machines since 2005 as an engineer and a business leader. This podcast is the product of my passion for electric and autonomous vehicle technology. I'm here to share knowledge from some of the world's leading experts, as well as my own insights. Join me as we accelerate the transition to cleaner, safer and smarter vehicles and grow the industry around the world. Welcome to the eTech podcast. And today it's our 100th podcast. Wow, 100 episodes. I mean, I've got to say, I never thought I would be recording this episode when I first started doing this podcast. What an absolutely amazing number to hit. I'd first of all like to start by thanking all of the listeners who continue to follow the show. You're in really great company. I've met some of you in person and heard from a lot of people through social media and email and various other things. Huge thank you. If you do ever see me out and about, do feel free to tap me on the shoulder at a trade show or something like that. Also, thanks a lot to the guests who come on the show from all kinds of companies around the world. You know, it's amazing to speak to everyone. What a lot of people might not realize is there's all sorts of booking people in the background. So there are people who organize those guests and approach me and say, hey, would you like to talk to such and such? They can make a great contribution. So thank you to those people as well for bringing fantastic guests to me. I couldn't make this show without Alice and Tim at TL Multimedia. They help me produce these episodes. You guys do such a fantastic job, without which I definitely would not have been able to make it to episode 100. So, for the 100th episode, what are we going to do? I had all sorts of thoughts about the direction that I could take this episode in. And I think really a bit of reflection from me on the past, a bit on the present, and a look to the future. When the podcast first started, as a lot of people will know, I was running a business called Avid Technology. I set up Avid in 2004 to develop control systems and sensors and electronics for the automotive market. And very quickly, Avid became a leader in electric vehicle drivetrain components and drivetrain integration and technology. And we had a fantastic time at Avid, a pretty long run of it, built up a wonderful team there. I exited Avid to an American group called Turntide a couple of years ago. And, massive shout out to my former colleagues there and to the team at Turntide. It's really nice to see the business still running it is today, and you guys doing some fantastic work as you're still doing in the field of electrification. I picked the podcast up and I took it with me because the podcast was my voice, and those guys didn't really want me whittering on about in their business. So I took the podcast and rebranded it, as you will now see. It's the eTech 49 podcast, and that's been running now for a few years in this format. And I've continued to make the sort of content that was proving popular when we first started out. So, the purpose of the podcast really was to talk about electric and autonomous vehicles, about technology, about energy systems and more. And really from a technical perspective, what I was trying to do was create a podcast for engineers. So by engineers for engineers, and I think that's what we've done. Most of the guests that I have on are from a technical background. And, we've had some real fantastic discussions with people who are massive experts in their field. From time to time, I take an episode by myself and I will talk about things, particularly questions that I've been asked and things like that during the episode. So, the format moving forward is going to be much the same. So interviews with guests who are doing exciting things connected to electric vehicle technology, autonomous vehicle technology, energy systems, and all the points that they touch in our world. So it's been really, fantastic journey so far. So after selling my business, I plan to have a quieter life, and that lasted for about 5 minutes. But my wife does like to remind me still that I did promise to take it a bit easier, which is fair to say kind of hasn't really ended up happening. I became involved pretty much straight away, actually, with a number of businesses in a strategic advisory capacity, doing a wide range of things. So helping develop turnaround plans for businesses that weren't quite performing as well as, shareholders or the board wanted, helping companies develop high growth, scale up strategies, where they were at that sort of inflection point in their market. I've worked with investment banks, so some big banking groups, helping them draw up investment theses and review investment cases in different businesses, and a whole lot more. It's been a really brilliant period where I've had the opportunity to work with some fantastic people and some really great businesses, all over the world. But now I am mainly working with a sensor technology business. It's a company called Transense Technologies. So it's kind of a little bit back to the beginning in that, when Avid originally started, one of the key products was a sensor technology. So now with Transense, sensor technology business and a measurement systems company, it's a really fantastic company. I originally started working with them, helping the board out as an advisor, and it's kind of grown and grown from there. I think, and I've said this to a few people, but openly say it here, I'm basically a terrible consultant. I enjoy the doing way too much. And Transense is a business that's on a really amazing journey now. 2 very distinct business units, some great technology, fantastic team that we're building, a growing customer base of some absolutely amazing blue chip customers. So massive shout out to my colleagues there. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you, and I'm very much looking forward to doing more of that in the future. Now, we could do an entire episode just about Transense, but I won't do that right now. If you want to learn more about that business, and particularly about the journey that we've been on there in the last couple of years, we did record a really nice podcast a little while ago. So with myself and the chairman of Transense, we were interviewed for a podcast called In the Company of Mavericks, where we went into the full story. So if you're interested in that, I'll put some links down into the show notes that you can follow up on and hear all about that business and what we're doing there. I still do a little bit of advisory work for some companies in addition to the Transense role. And, you guys, if you're listening, you know who you are. And I really do appreciate the work that we do together and getting to come and visit you, especially my friends in Denmark. So for today's show, the sort of current, present looking part of the episode, I thought it was appropriate to dip a little bit into what we are seeing around us at the moment in the market. So what is the present state of things? Where are we now? And I think, it's fair to say that there's an awful lot of stuff going on in the world, a lot of which I don't understand and I'm not going to talk about. But, the particular thing of interest for me is headlines like Volvo abandons electric car plans and Volkswagen warns of electric car sales chaos. And more and more and more coming all the time. The past month has been particularly strong for it. We get asked all the time, I have lots of questions about what's happening to the electric car market. Is it falling apart? A lot of friends, a lot of family members, anecdotally, my wife told me that one of my young son's friends was asking her about, electric cars and that they read that such and such was stopping making them because they weren't working out very well. So, it's really starting to get a little bit into the public psyche, I think, that we have a big problem. So what is really happening? Is this really the death of the electric car industry? The other classic one, has there been a hydrogen engine invented that will destroy the entire EV industry? So, bit for discussion there. I think I'll lead in with a quote that might help you guess the direction of travel I'm going to take on this. You might have heard this quote before. It's from a very famous chap called Mark Twain. And he said, "The report of my death was an exaggeration," or words to that effect. Now, you might guess where I'm going to go from this. What you also might not realize, that Mark Twain quote is quite a famous one because he genuinely had been asked whether or not he was ill or dead or dying by someone. And he wrote a fairly, typical for Mark Twain, interesting response to it. the full response that he wrote, which I went out and found, and I will try and quote you as best as I can here, goes along the lines of, "I can understand perfectly how the report of my illness got about. I have even heard on good authority that I was dead. James Ross Clemens, a cousin of mine, was seriously ill 2 or 3 weeks ago in London, but is now well. The report of my illness grew out of his illness. The report of my death was an exaggeration." I think the last 2 sentences here are rather apt when thinking about the current reporting on the electric car market. The report of my illness grew out of his illness. The report of my death was an exaggeration. So, there's been a lot of negative press about the EV industry, and, that's really amidst the traditional OEMs in particular, struggling with weak demand in their key markets. And to kind of understand what's going on there, you've got to step back a little bit, because we had a collapse of car sales for very obvious reasons during the COVID pandemic. And since then, it's a few years ago now, but sales have been recovering. And initially that was pretty strong. And actually, if people probably can remember this, but after the pandemic, there was a massive shortage of vehicles. Demand outstripped supply. And, the OEM supply chains, and especially the semiconductor parts, struggled to kind of scale up for the automotive sector needs again. The semiconductor industry in particular had a bit of a perfect storm of issues. Massive demand from consumer electronics and the global computing industry, which kind of was caused in a lot by changes in working patterns and habits during the pandemic, as we all kind of shifted to cloud computing and working from home, and at the same time, the kind of advancement of AI and the computing demands that created. So the semiconductor industry was really, really busy. And, basically the semiconductor industry has this customer base it's an important customer base. But when you're a supplier to a car company, they're pretty tough companies to deal with. So a lot of semiconductor companies took the decision basically to kind of restrict their supplies into the automotive industry and concentrate more on some other sectors. So that really led to a huge problem that we saw in the industry. And, the semiconductor industry scaling back up again, very long lead time production processes, difficult to run plants, things that don't really like being wound down or stopped at all, the fabrication industry. So this is what we knew as the chip crisis. So the chip crisis was a sort of phenomena that had a big impact on the automotive industry. It became quite difficult to get various different types of chips. There was lots of chopping and changing had to go on, taking modules out of cars, redesigning things for different microcontrollers than maybe had originally been done with it, and all sorts of things. The chip crisis has largely settled down. A few things have had an impact on that. Production levels stabilizing, new production capacity being brought online, especially significantly in Europe and the USA. And actually, just last week, I had the privilege of going to Dresden. And, it's amazing to see there, Dresden in Germany, the huge investment that's going into new semiconductor fabs in that area. Also, similar things happening in the USA where there's a big investment in new production capacity. So one of the sort of positive things, I think, that came out of the chip crisis and the whole sort of era supply chain squeeze during COVID was a realization that, without the semiconductors, you can't make a lot of essential products, and that includes cars, but it also includes, things like food manufacturing equipment, medical devices, all sorts of things. We're very, very reliant on semiconductors in almost everything. And even things that we don't think rely on semiconductors because they're normally relying on some sort of machine or manufacturing plant or computing system to make and deliver the products, all of which is driven by semiconductor industry. And that's really the building blocks of our kind of modern world. So governments in Europe and the US have kind of cottoned onto that after, maybe 20 years of being a little bit asleep at the wheel in that respect. And semiconductor manufacturing being seen as something, suitable for low-cost economies. And we were happy for that to be done in Asia, whilst we concentrate on the clever stuff of the manufacturing of the semiconductors and things like that in the US and Europe. But, really that hasn't worked out so well. But getting to the nub of it, the semiconductor industry is stabilizing. New production capacity has been brought online. And, that kind of helped to settle things out in that respect. When we look at the car market and we look at the recent trends, we can see exactly what happened during COVID, the collapse in demand, and then actually the quite rapid rebirth in the market when the pandemic settled down. But then when we look a little bit closer now, on the face of it, so the last 6 to 12 months, we can actually see demand growing again in new car registrations. So new car registrations are actually up in the last 6 to 12 months. But that doesn't reflect the whole picture, because on a longer term basis, post-COVID, the whole industry still hasn't fully recovered to the level that it was at pre-COVID, plus the total number of registrations also now includes quite a lot of new companies or companies that maybe weren't selling, particularly in the Europe and the US, in any sort of volume a few years ago. So, overall, the automotive industry is growing and is recovering, but it's not growing at the kind of rate it did immediately after COVID, and it still has its issues. Now, my take on this, and some people might disagree with me here, but I think one of the biggest underlying factors in that has got to be the cost of finance. A few years ago, interest rates globally pretty much were almost zero, so effectively you could borrow money really, really cheaply. And what that meant, I'm not an engineer, so not completely understanding all of the economics and stuff like that, but being able to borrow money cheaply means you can buy expensive assets, so things like cars, and the cost of financing that asset is pretty low. And most companies will buy vehicles either through leasing or on some sort of finance deal rather than paying for them all up front. Now, what happened post-COVID, the growth in global demand and things getting back to, let's say, quote unquote, some level of normality, a bit of an economic bounce. But then, and I actually remember thinking, why now? But we had barely a moment to pause, and we had the terrible events in Ukraine. Russia chose to invade Ukraine for reasons which are completely beyond me, but they decided to do that. And because of the importance of Russia to the global oil market and energy markets, so a big oil and gas supplier, that sent the costs of energy absolutely through the roof. The thing is, the cost of energy going through the roof made everything more expensive, because we need fuel for vehicles to deliver stuff. We need oil to go into plastics to make stuff, and so on and so on. Every business uses energy in some way, shape, or form. The semiconductor companies I've just spoken about, one of their biggest input costs is the cost of energy to keep their fabs running, keep the plants in operation. So we had this huge spike in the cost of energy, and that caused very rapid inflation. So it caused the cost of things to increase very, very rapidly. Now, to me, it seems like, and I sort of came up with this analogy while thinking about this episode, that the economy and the sort of national banks, it's a bit like one of those downhill go-karts where there's a lot of things can affect the speed at which it's traveling, but there's no steering and there's only one brake lever to pull. So it doesn't kind of matter what happens to you. To save yourself, you can only pull one brake lever, and you have to work out how hard you're going to pull it. Really, increasing interest rates is the equivalent to pulling that brake lever. We're taking money out of the economy because it increases the cost of servicing debt, like mortgages. And most people, they buy a house, they're dependent on mortgages. But even if you rent a house, you're still dependent on the cost of money, because the person who's bought the house that you're living in has probably borrowed some of the money to buy the house. So the basics, things like where we live, the cars we drive, they're all dependent on the cost of servicing debt and on finance. Loans for new machinery, for business and business investment, all of a sudden get a lot more expensive, and it makes it harder for companies to decide about whether or not to invest. So it's a bit odd, trying to reduce oil and energy prices that are driving inflation up by pulling the interest rate brake. It's always going to have a very, very delayed response, to reduce demand to the extent where you're going to reduce energy consumption to actually bring the cost of it back down again. You've got to do an awful lot to do that. And we're still kind of bobbing all over the place in terms of energy costs and oil costs in the system. It's obviously stabilized and it's a lot better than it was. But, we are now at a point where the big national banks, Bank of England and so on, are starting to look at and actually implement reductions in interest rates. And that is going to start to free up the car market again, because we need to have access to finance to buy vehicles. So really, any kind of slowing in the purchase of cars in general, I think the cost of finance has got to be having a big impact on that. Less discretionary money to spend on new things. And, the new car purchase is going to be so much more expensive because of the higher cost of borrowing. So a 35K car, at the moment, we're looking at something like a 10% cost of finance in a lease deal or a finance deal versus maybe 2% a few years ago. So 8% difference. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of a monthly cost difference, it's going to be a couple of £100 difference on a £35,000 car. On a £65,000 car, it's more like £500 a month. In some cases, actually, when people are going to renew their cars and renew their car finance, they're actually finding the cost pretty much to go from one car that they had to another car that's a new version of the same thing are pretty much doubling, because the cost of finance is now such a huge proportion of that monthly payment compared to what it was. Now, a lot of manufacturers are starting to subsidize this. So, certainly in the UK and other parts of Europe, we've seen cheap interest rate deals coming through for private car buyers. Typically, though, those sort of deals are not available to businesses. And businesses are a major buyer of new electric vehicles on lease or other financing because of the various incentives around that. So, it's a big problem that the car in general is costing more per month now than it ever has. Partly driven by some growth in car purchase prices. During the shortage post-COVID, the prices escalated. So we kind of have a new normal in terms of what the expectations are for the cost of a car, and it's significantly higher. People often will rile about the cost of an electric vehicle, but if you look at a regular combustion engine vehicle, they are significantly more costly than they were even, say, 5 years ago on a like-for-like basis. But the biggest impact, because very, very few people buy a car outright, so they're not really interested in the purchase price of the vehicle. They're interested in the financing cost or the lease cost of the vehicle, and where interest rates are has had a massive impact on that. The move downwards in interest rates will help the market, and that it'll help the market improve. And what we can actually see in the numbers is that the overall sales of electric vehicles are actually still growing. And when you look at the total, the macro stats for the market, electric vehicle sales are still growing, and they're growing strongly. They're not accelerating in their kind of year-on-year growth gains in the same way that they were a couple of years ago, so that's for sure. Like, the rate of growth has slowed, but it's still growing. And, talking like globally, something like 35% growth in electric vehicle sales on a like-for-like basis on the prior year, depending on whose numbers you look at. That can be as high as 50% growth. So, it's a market that is very much growing despite the headlines. So, why the headlines? Some of the press, I think, has come from the OEMs themselves. They're struggling to explain to shareholders why they are struggling as businesses. And I think the EV transition has made something of a convenient bogeyman. There's some other complex reasons behind that. There's definitely a bit of politics, bit of kind of funding for this kind of lobbying and negative PR and press coming from some of the traditional industries, and particularly the oil industry itself, even driving some of that. And, you accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist there, but you can actually directly make some of those links back. But I think some of it is just actually simply, I don't know if you call it newsmanship, but I remember looking like beyond the headline, the old saying of never let the truth get in the way of a good story from the press industry. So the Volvo story is quite an interesting one, and that the headline that I read in more than one publication literally read Volvo abandons electric car, or Volvo abandons electric car plans. And when you read the headline, it really did appear that Volvo was giving up on electric cars. And I remember seeing that story, and I like Volvos, I own a Volvo, thinking, wow, that's not good. And then I read the story, and really, I couldn't believe the difference between the headline and the actual story. So the actual story is that Volvo has said, well, originally, in 2030, we'd planned that 100% of our car sales were going to be electric. We don't think we can do that now. We think it's going to be 90% of our car sales are going to be electric by 2030. So, the headline grossly kind of distorts the truth in the story, but you had to read the stories in full to really get to that truth, and a bit of a problem with the reporting there and sensationalization of actually what was kind of not really a very interesting story. When you dig a little bit deeper again, so why has Volvo made that change? Why are they now saying we're not going to be 100%, we're going to be 90%? So the interesting thing there is that's largely product planning. The new BEV platforms that Volvo are introducing have been delayed. Anyone who's been following the EX90, for example, will know that that was announced into the market initially a year or more ago. You couldn't order the car. They were giving quite extended lead times on the vehicle. Only in the last couple of weeks, they've formally launched it with, journos being able to drive them, and we're starting to see reviews of that car come through. The sister car to the EX90, the Polestar 3, also has had similar delays. So those cars were announced a long time ago, and you were meant to be able to buy them, and they were meant to be starting delivering them. But those programs are probably 12 months late, I think, at least in terms of getting the car into the market. So, Volvo is clearly behind the scenes finding it a little bit harder to get their EV product platforms pulled together and launched and out in the market. And, that's understandable. It's a big change for them as a business, and I am pretty sure they're going to get on top of that in the market. But that's caused them to look out into the future and say, actually our target that we originally had for 2030 is no longer going to be achievable. And, we don't think that's what's going to happen. But 10% off the target. So not quite the headline of abandoning the electric vehicle journey. The other company that's made the headlines in a massive way in the last couple of weeks is Volkswagen. Volkswagen, they are clearly struggling as a company. Really interesting business, has been phenomenally successful over the years. Obviously, massive part of the German economy. A lot of people in Germany work for Volkswagen. It's very strongly unionized company. They find it really difficult to close plants in Germany, and really the big news story in the last couple of weeks has been they're now actually saying, look, we think we're going to have to shut some plants and we're going to have to cut some capacity. So that's a huge problem for Volkswagen in the market. But I sort of thought, well, it's interesting. They're coming out with this. What does that really mean? So are their sales like massively down? And when I looked at Volkswagen's sales figures, actually, I was quite surprised. In Europe and the Middle East, the sales are pretty flat. So, their sales haven't grown, but a big, long-established company like that, you wouldn't necessarily expect sales to grow. They haven't necessarily grown, but they haven't massively declined. In South America, actually, the half one 2024 numbers were 15% up compared to the prior year, like for like. And in the USA, they were 8% up. I mean, 8% growth for a company like Volkswagen is pretty phenomenal. Obviously, though, we're still in the kind of frothy sorting ourselves out post-COVID world. So even with flat sales or growth as it is, that's probably not to the capacity that they were at a few years ago. So essentially what you can see from that is, it's really not a new problem. They're not suddenly going, oh no, we can't sell cars today. We didn't know about this yesterday. This is an issue that Volkswagen, I think, have seen coming for a long time and possibly been kicking down the road in terms of doing something about. Where Volkswagen does have a problem is in Asia. So, sales in China are 7% down in the first half of this year. That's a big number. The Chinese market had been a big success for Volkswagen and somewhere where it was selling a lot of units and being very successful. In the rest of the APAC region, Asia Pacific, their sales are actually down a whopping 16%. So that is going to be hurting them in terms of losing sales in those regions. I think the key in those regions is new competition from domestic Chinese auto manufacturers who, 5-6 years ago, the product coming out of those companies wasn't exciting, wasn't quality product. Now, again, just last week, I had the privilege of going to the Automechanika show in Frankfurt, and there was a whole hall dedicated to Chinese OEMs. So electric cars there from Geely, from SAIC, Dongfeng, probably some others, definitely some others I've forgotten about because there was absolutely loads of them. And, the product looked phenomenal. And obviously you're not going to put your worst product on a stand at an exhibition, but I do remember going to shows sort of 5 or 6 years ago where you could spot the Chinese cars from a mile off because they basically didn't look very good. These cars looked amazing. I was genuinely interested in how they were built, in the quality, the features. Not quite sure the big infotainment systems are my cup of tea, but a lot of interest in those vehicles. So very successful in the Chinese market, and that is hurting Volkswagen in that space. And I think that's probably where the company is feeling the most pressure right now. It's interesting for them as a business. There's basically no way that when you look at their figures, it's not a sudden decline in sales, which is causing them problems. Although that's how they're kind of choosing to present it. It is actually a much longer tail than it appears in terms of the capacity that they have globally and the current sales that they're at. There hasn't been some seismic catastrophic event in the last 6-12 months that's really caused them a huge problem. And sure, again, it's also been widely reported for Volkswagen they've got issues in terms of launching new vehicles, getting new vehicle platforms out into the market and up and running. I think, a lot of people talk about the competitiveness of cars from companies like Volkswagen, and I think that there's a lot to be said for Volkswagen know how to build a car. You can't accuse them. So yeah, they might do things a little bit in excess. They have longer engineering processes, but that's because they are trying to ensure that the car that you get doesn't have any issues. And obviously that doesn't always work because they sometimes do, but cars are a very, very complicated thing, and trying to bring all these things together. Some changes in the industry around software and electronics architecture and things like that Volkswagen is kind of grappling to come to terms with. But the big thing that I was going to mention there is that the historic traditional OEMs, I think they almost are a victim of their legacy. So when you look at a new car manufacturer like Tesla or like BYD that's been set up in the last few years, they've had to do a lot of stuff. They've had to learn quick. They've had to invest in things. But in some ways, they are kind of free of some of the legacy baggage that the existing OEMs have. So when you look at the Volkswagen Group, one of the things that leaps out in terms of their financial statements is the amount of money that they are plowing into their pension fund. So you think, well, so? But, as an older company, Volkswagen was around at the time when people used to get and expect final salary pension schemes and this sort of thing. And actually, they've got a huge unfunded pension liability that they're sitting on, that they're having to pump money into every single year just to make sure that there's enough funds in the coffers for their retired population who are claiming pensions. So who aren't actually productive in the company anymore, but people who are claiming pensions now, are going to be claiming pensions in the near term, have got enough. It would be catastrophic for the economy of the countries where these companies are. I mean, Volkswagen has a situation, Ford has a very similar situation, GM has a similar problem. Obviously, you think about the direct employees of the company and all that, but actually, you've got huge retired populations. Now, you could argue all day about, should the companies at those times have given the pension benefits that they did without the funding properly being in place. Obviously the world was different, life expectancy was different, economic growth prospects, etc. But it's a huge problem that the legacy automakers are dealing with, and it's one that isn't really talked about very much at all. So when you're buying your VW car, there's a significant chunk on the sticker price of that car, which is going to fund the pension fund, and simply a newer car manufacturer doesn't have to worry about such things like that. So Volkswagen's problems are complicated. Are they because of BEVs? No. And actually, when you look at the BEV and the hybrid sales and shipments from Volkswagen, they're actually doing all right. In terms of they are still growing their BEV shipments, their PHEV shipments. So, lots of stuff happening at Volkswagen on that front. But it is a company with a lot of issues I'm sure we're going to be reading a lot more about in the next few months. So what we are also about to see in the market is a huge wave of electrification coming from the heavy-duty market. Particularly significant, and based on the events that I was at last week and the one I'm going to talk about now, you can probably guess when I'm recording this podcast, but this week there is a huge truck show, like the biggest truck show in Europe, and it's called the IAA. And that show is happening. It's like the go-to event for European truck manufacturers, showing off their latest products and everything, and it's a fantastic, huge event. If you're in the truck industry, it's the one to go to in Europe particularly. Don't think there's really an equivalent event in the US. If you know about it, tell me, because I'd love to know. But there is one uninvited guest this year at the IAA, and it's very, very significant, I think, that this year's IAA has Tesla visiting with their fully electric semi-truck. There's the Tesla Semi. Now, that's an articulated tractor unit to people and my friends and listeners in the UK. A big truck, the kind of thing you'd see on the motorway with a trailer attached to the back of it, where the bit of the front is articulated in the middle from the bit of the back, semi-truck. The mainstay of our logistics and distribution industry. The Tesla semi-truck has been on the road for a little while in the US, and I've heard some amazing stories from people operating these on trials in the US and actually clocking up real mileage in real operations. Saw some great presentations at an event I was at earlier this year in the US, where they were talking about, how these Tesla trucks are being used, where they're proving the most beneficial. And the thing that was the big surprise, when electric trucks are being talked about today, everyone talks about short haul. So local distribution, the van dropping stuff off at your house, the sort of slightly bigger trucks that are operating in city centers, and it's the apparent no-brainer for electric trucks. But actually the trials that have been running in the US with the Tesla Semi had found that it was very good in long-haul operation. And that there was almost a gasp of surprise in the room that I was in, and then a ton of questions to the poor chap who made the presentation on this about how well they'd found the Tesla truck to actually operate on long haul operations. It appeared from what had been found and the data that there were some pretty amazing cost savings in operation. And basically, what people were saying was, look, the truck market, yeah, in some places we do have particular problems with emissions. in the US, the California ports have got a very particular problem with the emissions in and around the port, and they're pushing to try and deal with that with low emission vehicles and electric vehicles to get rid of the tailpipe emissions altogether. So there's some specific things, but in general, the trucking industry, cares about trying to make money. It's very hard to make money in the truck industry, super competitive, very tight margins. So if you can have even the slightest advantage over your competitors, you're going to do that, and you're going to do it quickly. And the presentation was basically saying, look, these electric trucks are saving us a lot of money. We can run them in service. We can run them on short-haul operations. We can run them on long-haul operations, but they're proving significantly less expensive to own and operate than the equivalent combustion engine truck. And also the other point that they were making is the only reason we're not running all of these now is because you can't buy them. There isn't enough for sale. And again, people who follow it closely will know Tesla has delayed the production of the semi-truck a number of times, and it's essentially because they just can't actually make enough batteries for the cars and their other products yet, let alone adding the significant extra demand from the semi-truck, because obviously it needs a pretty huge battery pack. So you're going to start to see, obviously they're planning for that, they're building capacity, they're looking at what's happening elsewhere in their markets. But as they have the capacity to start putting more of these semi-trucks into the market, there is a very clear demand there because of what's been demonstrated in terms of the potential cost savings. Now, in Europe, obviously that market is different. So the European truck market is very different to the US truck market. Our trucks look different for a start. And we've got some established manufacturers, some of the same names as in the passenger car industry. So Volkswagen, who I was just talking about, they span off their commercial vehicle business a few years ago. So Scania trucks and MAN trucks, the business is called Traton now. But you've also got Daimler, who span their truck business into a sort of slightly separate entity. Daimler trucks, Mercedes cars, Mercedes trucks, and so on and so on. So there's a number of very established European truck manufacturers. Now, they've all got electrification programs. They're all putting vehicles on the road. I think it's fair to say a lot of the European ones have been really concentrating on the local distribution market and sort of smaller trucks as opposed to long-haul trucks. But I've seen lots of signs from the companies that I work with on things like developing axles and drivetrains that are very specific to more like long-haul articulated tractor unit type operations rather than the short regional delivery, the lighter weight regional delivery trucks. So it's really amazing to see Tesla coming to the IAA. Absolutely fantastic. Great to see the results that they're starting to get in Europe. So really good to see that product launched in Europe. And good to see it coming in alongside some strong offerings from the other manufacturers, and it's going to be interesting to see how that market plays out. The other truck manufacturers have been, doing electric trucks for a while. Obviously, Tesla does have some advantages, particularly in terms of the scale that it's got on batteries through the rest of its business. But I think it's fair to say there's going to be a lot of activity there, and we're going to see a lot of interesting stuff happening in the commercial vehicles sector in the next year or two as these products start to really get into the market and get at scale. Not to mention, putting in the charging networks for them as well, which is already starting to happen now. We're seeing the megawatt scale charging infrastructure going in to support those trucks in operation. So, in conclusion, at the end of this podcast, so trying to keep it to time, the electric car is well and truly here to stay. Is the industry dead? No, it absolutely is not. And it's being joined by the electric truck. This is fantastic. It's lower pollution on our streets. These are more efficient vehicles to operate. Massive CO2 savings in the life of the vehicle. Energy independence. So, the way to reduce our oil costs, the demand for oil is by moving to electrified transport. That's just going to help the whole energy system, help the whole economy, take away the threat of things like that massive inflation that we've just been living with caused by spiking oil costs. So we're in for a really interesting ride over the next couple of years. Will it be more interesting than the last couple of years? I hope in some ways it's definitely not as interesting, but I think there's a lot coming from a technology perspective, and there's a lot happening in our industry, not to mention any of the autonomous stuff, which we haven't touched on here. But that's a story for another day. So thanks a lot for listening. I do have some great podcasts coming, some really good interviews with some people absolutely doing state-of-the-art, cutting-edge stuff in their industries. If you're doing something interesting in the EV space and you'd like to talk to me, then do drop me a line. Always interested to hear from people. If you've got any questions, we actually used to get a lot of questions. That hasn't really been the case for the last few months. But if you've got any questions or a topic in particular that you'd like me to cover, then also drop me a line. Love hearing from people. Love getting feedback on the show. So thanks for listening. Lots more to come, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you again soon.